All right, I can see your screen now, Scott, so you should be good to go. So again, here's Scott Lincoln. He's gonna chat with us for a little while about locating tornadoes. So go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so now I have the wonderful thrill of trying to captivate people with a completely different topic. So hopefully if I can just captivate people to the 50% of that last topic, which was amazing, then that'll be good. And as you might have seen on one of the maps that was kind of inserted in one of those slides, that other than just being the senior service hydrologist here at Chicago, I also wear a couple other hats, and one of those is doing a lot of mapping, which will basically play a pretty big role in what I'm about to talk about. A kind of a rather mysterious event from early in Chicago's history, a tornado that did not have a lot of information about it, just that it happened and supposedly was the first tornado ever to happen in Chicago. But beyond that, we didn't know exactly where. So in the next few minutes, I'll talk about that original story, what was the accepted narrative of this tornado. I'll talk about some of the weather records we were able to find, some of the limited pieces of information about the environment associated with the tornado, talk about some of our new recent research, and then provide a revised account of the tornado. So as a little bit of background, we do frequently receive requests about the number of tornadoes that impact Chicago. I mean, our media are constantly asking, and we get one more little EF0 that goes a couple blocks in the city, and immediately, oh, is this the 33rd tornado that's ever hit Chicago? And where does this rank in the climatology? That question comes up all the time. And some tornado tracks, especially those after 1950, we can be more confident in. They're a little more clear. They were, especially as we get closer to modern times, they were surveyed, and especially as we get really modern, they were put into the DAT, so we could probably be down to the block. But those early tornadoes are much more uncertain, as you might imagine. Different sources of information from like the Significant Tornadoes book or some databases that Fujita kept would be really your only source other than old newspaper articles. So one of the most uncertain in our history is a tornado that happened on May 22nd, 1855, typically referred to as either the Norwood Park or Jefferson Park tornado. It killed multiple people and was one of the earliest known tornadoes in Northeast Illinois. So the original story goes something like this in the Chicago Tribune, which was the, basically until the last couple of years, is the most frequently cited source talking about the tornado, says that there was a tornado that lifted a home off its foundation, killed 3 of 9 occupants, and also produced some fairly large hail. And oops, I clicked the button one too many times. So the events to which we allude took place in the town of Jefferson near Jefferson Mills, 16 miles distant from Chicago. And that really was the only location information provided in the article. So to give a little quick geography lesson as to how that's associated with Chicago, back in 1855, Chicago was a much, much smaller city, centered very close to where the Chicago River outlet into Lake Michigan is located, surrounded by marshland and prairie land, and not a lot of other, villages or towns of significant substance. Outside of Chicago, the county was broken up into townships. So the county, Cook County was broken up, and sometimes you would hear those townships described as town of blank. So for example, if someone was referring to Jefferson Township, they might say town of Jefferson. So kind of keep that in mind, that it's not quite the same as we might say, town of this today, when we mean an actual place of lots of houses and maybe a business district. This can actually refer to a rural place of just farmhouses, known as town of blank. So when someone says town of Jefferson, it can actually mean a couple different things. Back then, there not only was the Jefferson Township, but there also was a very small village near the center of that township, which had a post office, also called Jefferson, just to make things even more confusing. In 1889, that was a very large annexation of land around Chicago. Not all the land that's in the lighter gray, but a large portion of it, especially northwest of the city of Chicago, was annexed. Most of Jefferson Township got pulled into the city, And the location of that village of Jefferson within Jefferson Township became what is known as Jefferson Park and is now a neighborhood of the city. So all of that together, that is why it is kind of widely considered that this is the first tornado in Chicago history. And as you, I guess just to illustrate this point is, this one article has spread into numerous sources. So we have National Weather Service records that talk about this happening in Norwood Park. We've got weather blogs that even put it on a map, despite the fact it doesn't provide a lot of precise location details. We've had maps online and blogs. Tom Skilling has a column, for the Chicago Tribune and also for WGN where he talks about old tornadoes, and he's mentioned it at that location. So as you can see, this has spread everywhere despite not having a lot of precise details. Before I move on, I just want to talk a little bit about the weather conditions. We did take some time to dig into, what little was available just to see what the mechanism might have been, to cause the storm. Not very much is known. Official weather maps for the Signal Service, which became the Weather Service, didn't start until 1871. So this was, pre weather maps that you can just easily pull off of a server somewhere that have been digitized. But there are some limited reports of weather from volunteer observers that reported to the Smithsonian, and those were digitized by NCEI as part of what they call the Forts archive or the Forts project, because most of them were military forts, but some of them were just farmers out in the country that decided to volunteer taking daily weather observations. We retrieved records for 30 such sites across the Midwest where the information was available. Typically, temperature, dew point, cloud cover, and wind speed would be available. Sometimes some remarks written off to the right, but those were the primary pieces of information that we could pull from these manual logs. They were digitized manually and put into an Excel spreadsheet, and then extracted at specific times, like 7 a.m. on this day and 2 p.m. on this day, assigned to the lat long location of that town, and then we could put them on a map. So here's an example, the morning of the tornado, temperatures in the 70s, and you can kind of maybe piece together that there's maybe a warm front in northeast Iowa extending northeast from an area of low pressure. With limited data, it's hard to say for certain, but possibly an area of low pressure there. And notice that in Illinois, we're starting the day with really warm temperatures and south winds potentially already pushing 80 in north central Illinois. By the afternoon, so this would be just a few hours before the tornado occurred, we were pushing the mid 90s in north central Illinois. Dubuque, near the corner of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa, was at 99, which actually stood as their warmest May temperature on record until the 1930s in the Dust Bowl. And potentially that area of low pressure is probably moving to the east towards the Mississippi River, and possibly a lake breeze coming in off Lake Michigan, noted by the big difference in temperature. Like one county away from the lake in Wisconsin, we're at 90, but along the lakefront, we're at 69 with an east wind. And then by the late evenings, this was 9 p.m., several hours after the tornado, the lake breeze probably had moved a little further inland, but still good strong southwest winds in the interior of Illinois and that cold front nearing the river. So we know even from just newspaper reports, anecdotally, we know there was very hot and humid conditions in Illinois, even into southern Wisconsin. Possibly this lake breeze, it's really hard to be certain, but it's at least, there's some evidence suggesting that it could have been there. And we do know that lake breezes can at times, in certain situations, be a mechanism to produce storms along the western Great Lakes. So some new research into the tornado starting a few years ago. We decided to do another review of this tornado specifically to see if there was just any more detail we could find to help us narrow down the location. One of the things that really helped us is we recently discovered that many old newspaper articles had recently been digitized by the Library of Congress. It's a project that they called Chronicling America. And newspapers from all over the country back into the early to mid 1800s are available. Just for you can even search. They have like an AI routine that's scanned the text, and so it is a searchable text. Not always the best, but it gets a lot of the words pretty close. And also You know, I mean, it's just all like you can just skim through the pages just looking at the screenshots. It's really handy. So if you're doing any other historical research, this might be a good place to try. Also, there were old maps at the Library of Congress. I should point that out as well too. So many old maps of counties, cities, states, even back into the late 1700s are available on the Library of Congress. So some clues that we took from that Chicago Tribune article to see if we could find other, you know, other things to expand upon. You know, it talked about just one house being destroyed. It only mentioned one name, the last name Page. Talked about the township of Jefferson. It talked about very large hail, which also extended to the southeast, eventually reaching Chicago. The storm moved from northwest to southeast. And that was pretty much it. And luckily, with doing some searches on the Library of Congress, however, we did find a few other newspapers that talked about the tornado. Unfortunately, none of the Chicago newspapers have been digitized in that archive chronicling America, but we did find Ottawa Free Trader, which was published kind of in north central Illinois, and some articles in New York actually picked up the story from local papers. So we did find some name discrepancies. Some of the articles talked about an H page, so provided a first initial. There also was a completely different name. R.L. Wheeler was mentioned as someone who owned a home that was hit by the tornado. One of the victims that died was mentioned by the last name Gillette. And then we started getting some different names of towns. So not only did we get town of Jefferson and Jefferson Mills once again, but we started hearing town of Maine and 1 mile distance from a notable railroad, one of the first railroads built to the northwest out of Chicago. So then that led us to property maps. We decided we'd look at property maps from the 1860s and see if we can find the name Page or the name Wheeler near Jefferson Township. Well, it turns out we couldn't find any properties matching those names. But if we were to look in Maine Township, which is a location where some of the other articles mentioned the location of the tornado, and we were to line up 1 mile distance from the railroad and a 16-mile distance from the city, they actually lined up much better than Jefferson Township. And if we look at property maps there, focusing on, again, that location, that 1 mile distance from the railroad and the 16-mile distance from Chicago, turns out very close to the western X of where those two overlap. Not only did we find a Jefferson property, but we also found a Wheeler property. And one of the dots in the middle of the Jefferson property indicated there was a mill, along the river within their property. So certainly a very strong clue that perhaps the most widely used newspaper source just had the wrong township, and it really was in a different location entirely. Decided that we needed a little further confirmation, so we took a trip to the main library in Chicago to review microfilm of newspapers that published in the 1850s. It turns out that of the 4 newspapers publishing at the time, 3 of the newspapers were available on microfilm. And in reviewing those, we found out that actually the only newspaper that talked about this tornado happening in Jefferson Township was the Chicago Tribune, and every other newspaper said that it happened in Maine Township. So just kind of I guess some bad luck that the one newspaper that is the easiest to get your hands on, and not have to go to microfilm at a library, it turns out that one newspaper is the one that got the location wrong. For even further corroboration, we decided to use the free resource Family Search, which is similar to Ancestry.com, to see if there's any genealogical records that could help piece together what happened. Turns out that there was Census Records in 1860 that mentioned the name R.L. Wheeler and had many individuals living in the same home, all with the last name Page. And this was in Maine Township, now the new hypothesis of where the tornado location was. We also were able to find on the big consensus family tree on Family Search that the R.L. Wheeler was married to an individual named Sarah Maria Page, who was the daughter of Joseph Page and Samantha Page. And Samantha's date was, interestingly enough, indicated as May 22nd, 1855. So think back in those times, there was only like 700 people living in that township, and to have someone die at the date of the tornado is kind of another interesting potential clue. Another thing we noticed is that they had numerous children, each of which were born about 2 years apart, but there was a notable gap between 1851 and 1855. So our hypothesis at the time was that if someone had constructed this family tree based upon census records, any child born after the 1850 census but died before the 1860 census would not have been listed in that family tree. Luckily, we had one other source on Family Search. They have what's called their Pedigree resource file, which is just anonymous family tree snippets that people can submit. And they aren't that big consensus family tree that goes all the way, back into the 1400s and, to modern times that people build while they're doing their genealogy. These are just little snippets like, oh, I found something in, family records that talks about these people in the 1700s, and it might only have 2 or 3 generations, and they're just little snippets, out in the web of your family's past. Turns out that we found a hit for this family as well in those anonymous, at least submitted family histories. And in one of those, there were 2 additional children listed for Ransom and Sarah, both of which died on May 22nd, 1855, one of which was a child who was born that spring and only lived for 3 months. So then we decided to turn to the local history center. The town of Des Plaines is in Maine Township, and when we reached out to their historical society, it turns out that they were able to corroborate the vast majority of the things we found in the newspaper and in genealogical records. In fact, it turns out that some people had submitted old family histories to their center. They found them in their archives after we reached out to them, basically saying the same thing, that that the many members of the Page and Wheeler family were killed by this tornado on May 22nd, 1855, 2 of which were very young children. So we were able to build a family tree and show the individuals that were injured, the people that had passed away. It turns out there was like 10 people in this house when it was, lofted off of its granite foundation, and almost every single person in the house was injured. Several people killed, the 2 small children, the grandparent, and a visiting aunt from New York State who just happened to be, visiting at the time. And interestingly enough, and Brett told me to bring this up, is it seems like every single person that I've researched associated with this story is semi-related to me in some way, which is kind of interesting that I didn't even realize. Family Search says that like almost every single person, like witnesses of the tornado, the family, are either 6th or 7th cousins, back into like the 1700s, where I was able to find a common ancestor. So kind of an interesting little tidbit I found while I was doing this. So we have been able to revise the account based upon all available information. We believe that there was a storm track somewhere from Maine Township southeast to the city of Chicago. In addition to what I presented here, we did find other reports of hail, around the area of the tornado, and hail in Chicago. So we have a very approximate corridor that we believe the storm moved from roughly 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. on May 22nd. We also believe that, we have this approximate tornado track, which now now is believed to have occurred in the village of Des Plaines, near the modern day intersection of Lee Street and Oakton Street, now the location of a drive-through bank on Oakton Street. And as you might imagine, Des Plaines is not the city of Chicago, so it did not happen where previously was believed. Now, for more details, we have a couple places you can go if you want the technical side of things. We have an article that we published in BAMS. And for the kind of more the story side of things, there is an online story map. You can get to it if you just Google Des Plaines tornado of May 22nd, 1855. Since we published, however, we did find a few more pieces of information. It turns out there were letters written to the Smithsonian about the tornado, because it was one of the first that happened in northern Illinois. Also, some letters that were archived at the Des Plaines History Center. They have a backlog of letters they've been trying to transcribe. And while we were doing this, they happened to come across another letter written about the tornado by someone who was, like in his 70s and was writing to other family members and said, oh, back when I was a boy, I remember this tornado. And he gave pages of detail about how it moved and the directions that it changed, and about the hail and the family, the history of the family and how they were impacted by it. It turns out the tornado track is likely longer, so that map I showed you was from our publication, but we do have reason to believe the tornado track was longer, potentially making weird turns and maybe even changing direction entirely, like taking a 180. And also, we believe the tornado was visible from almost every vantage, that even though the rain and hail happened about the same time, it wasn't heavy enough to obscure the tornado, because we do have some witnesses that were easily 4 miles away and were watching it while it was hailing. So there are still some remaining questions. However, the one that we, maybe not a huge question, but like, what's this confusion over Jefferson? Obviously, there was that mill, the Jefferson mill, that showed up in the newspaper. It's possible that that family, the Jefferson family, they were so prominent in the area and built this prominent mill, and possibly even owned a general store near the mill. It's possible the reporter thought that was the town of Jefferson. It's along the same rail line. The last stop that they may have gotten off on the rail line was the Jefferson post office mail stop, or I mean, the train stop. And they may have believed they still were in the same town. That's one possibility. And other than that, we can't say for certain, but that's the best we can come up with. We still don't know where any of the victims are buried. All the birth records, death records, property records, all that was lost in the Chicago fire of 1871. So we don't really know. And even all the information we found so far from the family, they say they don't know where they were buried. The only cemetery for, within a few miles of this did not really start having burials until a few years after the tornado. So the Des Plaines History Centers told us that before cemeteries were organized, oftentimes people buried buried their family members on their property. And at the time, this was farmland, and now it is a kind of a dense suburban area of the Chicago metro. So you can kind of read between the lines there. It's entirely possible that the victims of this tornado are still in someone's backyard. And as far as like the tornado's track, we have a couple different, there's the one we published, but there's a couple other possibilities based upon the descriptions. Hard to say for certain. We just know that it hit that farmhouse, near that one corner in Des Plaines. But the one at the far right, I mean, it was a very detailed description of how the tornado tracked. It basically curved upon itself and then turned back another direction, which is kind of interesting. I'd like to acknowledge the records stored at Family Search. Without the genealogies, that we wouldn't have been able to corroborate a lot of the information. Obviously, the Library of Congress was a big help, the digitized maps and newspapers. The staff at the Harold Washington Library in Chicago put up with me for the better part of an 8-hour day, constantly asking them for more reels of microfilm, and they had to go back in the stacks and dig these out. So, a big help to them while I was sitting there drinking my coffee and reading old newspapers. Des Plaines History Center was a big partner on this, as well as the descendants of the family, who just happen to have, letters and other information about their descendants and those oral histories that they were able to share that helped piece this all together. And thanks to Brett, who, if it wasn't for him as a co-author telling me that I needed to publish this, it would have just been a little footnote in our Chicago Weather Service archive. So thanks to him for pushing me along the way to publish in BAMS. And I thought this might be an interesting slide to add. I didn't present this at the, when I last presented this at the GIS Association conference, but just maybe some lessons learned. If someone else is thinking of doing this at their office, really start with the Library of Congress, because you might find, even if a local newspaper is not archived there, newspapers back in the 1800s tended to pick up each other's stories. And I found out that the way that they did this, there was not really a newswire service back then. And even though telegraph existed in the mid 1850s, it cost like $10 to send a 1 or 2 sentence telegraph. At least that's from what I read. It didn't get cheaper until a few decades later. And so really they were not, using telegraph to share news, at least not whole stories. What they were doing is one newspaper would subscribe to another newspaper. So like the Chicago Tribune might be a subscriber to the New York Herald, and then it got sent via postal mail, and the Chicago Tribune would then publish some of the big articles from New York. And that's probably what you might find. If you're trying to look at an old event, you might find articles published in places you wouldn't expect, and it might say like from the such and such Tribune, and it be for the event you're looking at. If that doesn't help you, you might have to go find the local library kind of closest to where it happened and dig through microfilm. But and you also have the possibility to look at genealogical records. But I should point out that we had a really good match with this event, and I've tried going the genealogy route with a few other tornadoes, and it's not helped as much. So we did kind of luck out that we got so much information from the genealogy for this particular tornado. It might help you, but it might also, you might end up with a dead end if those families just don't share, the detailed information that we found from the Page and Wheeler family. So that is all I have, and would be interested in people's questions.
All right, well, thank you, Scott. That was fascinating. Like really interesting stuff. So if anybody has any questions, please throw your hand up and I can unmute you to ask Scott some questions. So I'm waiting here. Scott, how did you happen to realize that these folks were long-range relatives of yours?
Well, it was surprisingly easy, actually. So when you're using Family Search, which I have an account on, and again, like I said, it's free, but you do have to have a sign up with an email address. There's a button. You pick any person in this giant, the big consensus family tree, and once you're looking at that person's page, there's a button that says, "How am I related?" And when you click that, it'll do that little, the calculation, and not just the Page and Wheeler family. I clicked and it said that I was 7th cousins. Beyond what I've presented here, I've looked at all kinds of eyewitness accounts from people who had totally different last names, lived in different rural areas around the storm. And the vast majority of them, I found out I'm either 6th or 7th cousins, which is really interesting. And it's always on my mother's side. So someone who's a genealogist and smarter with that, maybe will tell me, oh, it's, very common to be 6th cousins with any person in the world. It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or something. But I thought that was still at least somewhat rare, especially to have it happen over and over and over. I mean, it's like 6 different people associated with the story that it did seem unrelated the way that the story is told back then, but then turns out, I'm related. So I don't know.
Oh, that's just crazy. All right, so we had a question from Todd Krause. It says, what entry, if any, is there in Tom Grazulis's book?
I have to try to remember. I think that his is similar to what went into the, I believe it's Finley, who wrote the Signal Service paper back in the late 1800s and basically documented all the known tornadoes up to that point. And I believe it says the same thing, that there was a tornado in Cook County near Jefferson. I'd have to go pull it off the shelf because that was one of the first things we looked at, like really early on, and I can't remember the exact entry, but I do remember that I don't think it was correct. That I believe he probably used the Chicago Tribune because that's what you can access, like on newspapers.com. It's easy to find, and it's a lot of these other newspapers too. I guess I didn't point this out. Several of those other newspapers eventually merged with other newspapers, which eventually merged with the Tribune. So like the one newspaper at the time that provided some of the most detail and put it in the right place, the Chicago Democratic Press, not just like 2 or 3 years after this tornado, they merged with the Chicago Tribune. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And it's hard then, to find the archives because even though the Tribune bought them out, they didn't archive the Democratic Press for some reason. And you don't find it on the newspapers.com to my knowledge. So I think it was, in the right county, but in the wrong place.
All right, so any additional questions from anyone here? I'll give it a minute or so. Otherwise, this is, again, this great, Scott, some good information for maybe any other office who would go through this process to use as a resource, and it's recorded, so we'll be able to share with everybody now. So, all right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I guess with that, I will let everyone have the rest of their day back. So thanks again for joining, everyone. Thank you to our presenters. It was a great guest speaker series today. So have a great one. Thanks.